So the moment the US signals that gold no longer has value, I think that will crash the market. I think we're going to see a demand shock and a supply shock, unlike anything the world has ever seen before. And I fully believe that once this kicks off, we're going to see $1 million per Bitcoin and higher, simply because of the demand shock feeding the supply shock.
Nos encontramos aquí con Samson Mow, fundador de JAN3. Y bueno, hoy vamos a estar hablando sobre todo el tema de reservas estratégicas de estados, adopción, estado nacional de estados, con Samson, que es una de las mayores autoridades en la actualidad respecto a este tema. Hello, la entrevista va a ser en inglés, pero bueno, tendremos una versión traducida. Hello, Samson. How is it going? How are you?
I'm good, Ivan. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for being here with us today.
Happy to be here.
I was telling you before we started recording the interview that last time we had the chance to talk was in November 2021. We were at El Salvador at the time, and President Nayib Bukele had just recently announced Bitcoin City's project with you on stage. Actually, you were with him at the stage. A lot has changed since then. Now, even the President of the United States is apparently becoming a Bitcoiner. In this context, I want to open with a broad question. Nation states embracing Bitcoin. Isn't that a contradiction? Wasn't Bitcoin supposed to separate money and state?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it comes up from time to time. People will ask me if if Bitcoin is supposed to be money for the people, why are you helping countries get Bitcoin? And I think it's a valid concern, but there is a point that is missed, which is that nation states adopting Bitcoin is separation of money and state. When we say we are here to separate money and state, it is separating monetary policy from the state, not necessarily separating money or valuable things from the state itself. I think these are two separate topics. You can protest the state by denying them revenue and funding, or not paying your taxes, but that's a separate issue, I think, from separating monetary policy. And I think separating monetary policy is the first step. If you want to reduce the size of the government, you have to do it in a lawful way and over time, gradually. I think it'll be very chaotic if suddenly governments just disappear very suddenly, and the world is just total chaos emerging. So probably better to have a gradual transition out, but definitely the first step is to remove monetary policy. And countries willing to do so, or doing so voluntarily, is probably a better way, because then they're on board with it. But the key thing to understand is that every government is sort of a machine that needs capital. It's already built, it exists, and it's consuming capital at a massive amount, every day. And they will incur debt as well if they have no capital. So they just want to consume money in all forms, whether capital or debt. And it seems to be these days, it's more so debt. But you have to feed the machine somehow. And if Bitcoin is valuable, which we all agree it is, then it is inevitable that governments will want what is valuable, right? Governments didn't come into existence saying gold was valuable. The value accrued to gold is from people, from the grassroots level, from people accepting it, using it. And then later on, it became a managed system where the government gets to mint coins and control the monetary supply that way. But with all forms of money, it is sort of based off of consensus of individuals that decide that we will use this thing, and then it gains network effects, and those network effects grow from that initial usage. And it's the same thing with Bitcoin. But yeah, if Bitcoin is valuable, countries will want Bitcoin. End statement there. It's just the fact.
Yeah, it's the natural way of things flowing. Like I if we want to separate the monetary policy from states and like have this mathematical artifact that, well, this kind of money that's regulated by the laws of mathematics and physics, do you think that the recognition, like, do you perceive nation states adopting Bitcoin is a form of capitulation to Bitcoin's monetary superiority? Like they are recognizing that Bitcoin is a superior form of money, a superior form of capital, as you said, and like they are capitulating from fiat somehow?
Yeah, it is, and it's somewhat surprising to see this. I thought there would be more resistance to adopting Bitcoin. So either they don't fully understand what it is they're doing, or they simply must capitulate, because at the end of the day, money is a way to motivate people to do things, right? And governments, these entities need people to do things like build the roads, or most energy is state owned, like building hydro dams or geothermal plants or whatnot. They need to compel people to do things, and you have different ways of compelling people to do things. You can have authoritarian governments, or totalitarian, which kind of just says, you go, Ivan, and you go and build this thing. And if you don't, you go to the gulag and you do something else. But they have to compel people to do things. They can't do things themselves in and of themselves. So they either need to use force or use money as an incentive. And if people decide that Bitcoin is money, then they suddenly find themselves that they have to get on board that train as well. They can't say, we're going to stick with dollars and you use Bitcoin, because the superior money is going to win out in the end. And there will be a point at which people just say, well, I don't want your dollars anymore. And you do see that in a lot of countries, like in Latin America, the countries that are suffering hyperinflation, the money ends up on the street. Nobody wants it anymore. So you can stick to your guns and say, we want to keep printing bolivars or whatever. But if people don't want it, it's just paper at the end of the day. So you have really no choice as a government. If people are saying Bitcoin is money, then you just have to get on board. And we're seeing this take off very rapidly, like you mentioned in the U.S. with President Elect Trump saying that they're going to create a strategic reserve, and they're going to, make Bitcoin make the U.S. the capital for Bitcoin, and they want to have all Bitcoin mined in the U.S. So it's sort of an inevitable endpoint for this, and we should see more countries following on as well, because most countries typically look towards the U.S. for guidance, approval, and kind of a nod that it's okay to do before they themselves do it.
Yeah, definitely. It's like somehow politicians are recognizing or realizing that they actually need to embrace Bitcoin to survive, even though Bitcoin can reduce their power, the power they have over the people with monetary policy, with people's time and people's energy encapsulated in the form of money. But do you think there is a reason behind, aside from all this marketing, aside from all this incentive for people to do things, as you said, for nation states to adopt Bitcoin? Like, do nation states need Bitcoin, in your opinion?
Well, they definitely need valuable assets, and Bitcoin is just, if you look at it as digital gold, it's really no different. So most countries accumulate gold for the same reason that they will need to accumulate Bitcoin. It's to ensure that they can back their money with something valuable, or use that valuable thing in the case of an emergency, like they need to transact somehow and their currency has failed. They can always go back to gold. But Bitcoin is just digital gold, if you want to look at it in a very simple manner, and countries should have digital gold. With physical gold, it's actually much harder to store, secure, and transact. And you also run into the issue of that you run into the issue that gold does not do any significant de-risking in terms of war and seizure. So if you have physical gold and you lose in a war or you're invaded, it's highly likely that that gold is gone and it's no longer yours. So you can't really use that to finance a counterattack or finance defense later on. But with Bitcoin, it's just information and it does not have a material form. So you can actually secure it after you're invaded and use that to counterattack. So I think strategically, Bitcoin is a must-have for countries.
And do you think right now that the world is like plagued with conflicts, with wars, invasions, etc.? Like Bitcoin is playing, like that's in this context, Bitcoin. That's one of the reasons states are considering Bitcoin as an strategic asset, like for this difficult to be seized by the state. Although, well, most of the bitcoins the states has it comes from seizures, so that's kind of a contradiction as well. But do you think war is becoming one of the prevalent reasons why countries and governments are considering Bitcoin as a valuable asset?
Well, I don't think necessarily it's war. It's more about acting as a geopolitical hedge. Because in times of conflict, you don't really know where the lines are going to be drawn for enemies and allies. And as evidence with Russia, you can be cut off from the current financial system very easily if you fall on the wrong side. And with BRICS countries drifting away from the dollar, that makes it much more difficult too in a multipolar world where it's not just the US dictating all the rules. You might need to trade with China and Russia. You kind of need to be careful which side of those lines that you fall on, because maybe your concern is not being cut off from SWIFT, but cut off from whatever the BRICS system is using because you need to trade. So I think Bitcoin is definitely the best option that most countries have, that you buy Bitcoin and it doesn't really matter which side you fall on. You're still sovereign. And to your point about the seizures, like, I think that really applies when a state force is applied to an individual. But I think it's much harder for one state to seize from another state. It's just the power differentials closer generally. But for a citizen of a state, it's very easy for the state to seize your assets because you're physically there, and every signal system can be weaponized and turned against you. And I think this is the other side of that question you asked early on, like, why do we do what we do? And I think it has a lot to do with preparing the world for a post-hyper-Bitcoinized state, which is finding ways to implement better legislation that enshrine the rights of individuals. Because if money is information, which is Bitcoin, is the norm, then do the current laws and protections that we have as people protect us from accidental seizure and theft, if not outright theft? And I think the answer is largely no, because your electronic devices can be seized at the border, and you can be forced to give up your password. But that changes when money is outside of the system, right? Like, someone could just take a photo as someone else searching your device, and now suddenly your seed phrase is gone. Well, not gone, but they have it, and they can drain your wallet. But there's tons of these things. Like, what about digital surveillance, right? Is that going to put your funds at risk? But the world has not engineered for money that does not exist within a system. All money is existing right now largely in the system. So if someone takes your bank password, what are they going to do? Move it to their own bank or another bank, but that can be undone. So there is no concern, I guess, from regulators that the rules are not strong enough. But in a Bitcoinized world, that is very dangerous. So there has to be a lot more that's done to enshrine the rights of individuals and protect their rights to privacy.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Uh, Previously you mentioned about the let's call it superiority of Bitcoin in comparison to gold, and yeah, a few days ago Michael Sager said something about the United States should exchange its gold for Bitcoin. What do you think about that process of gold of demonetizing gold in favor of Bitcoin in a country as the United States, which also has its history of the Bretton Woods system and like um, not like having the gold of other countries in exchange for US dollars, and right now, and after Nixon said gave the order of stopping the Bretton Woods system, just stopping that. So it's curious what it's going to happen in this kind of war, in a hyper Bitcoinized world, as you said. And do you think gold should be the way in which the United States earns or stack more Bitcoin?
Well, the thing is, if the US started to demonetize gold in favor of Bitcoin, I don't think that they would be able to stack a lot of Bitcoin from the gold, because monetary value is largely a social construct, right? Like, things have value because we think it has value. So the moment the US signals that gold no longer has value, they don't even need to sell it. They just need to say, we are going to sell gold for Bitcoin. That just changes everything instantly. And this is also why I believe things like the Omega candle are real, because these shifts in perception can be very rapid. It's not like they say we're going to sell gold for Bitcoin, and over the next 30 years, it's a slow sell-off at, what is gold at right now? 2,500 an ounce or something like that? I don't know. But, it's not going to hold that price over a 30-year period. I think it's going to be a shock, and everyone's going to start to dump gold. And when you think about it, what do you dump gold for? Are you going to dump gold and buy your own currency? That's just like buying your own bonds. It just makes zero sense at all. So I think it'll all flow into Bitcoin, and it's all going to happen very quickly. Now, the question is, would the US do that? I think strategically, it would be a brilliant tactical move, because my estimates are the US in aggregate probably has like 15 to 25% of all Bitcoin. That's spread out amongst corporations, ETFs, large holders, like a lot of people bought, and plus the own holdings of the US through seizure. But that's a lot of Bitcoin out there, and I think there's a good chunk of it in the US. So if they can reason out through first principles that gold is going to die eventually, and the dollar is going to die eventually, then this would be a master stroke in strategic execution, that you just jumped over those long declines and said, Bitcoin is it now. And guess what? We have the most Bitcoin, and you have gold, which is now worthless. So it's a brilliant move strategically. Now, whether or not that will happen, I think it will eventually, but the sooner they do it, the stronger the position is, and the more gold they can sell for Bitcoin as well. So it's just a question, is the Trump administration bold enough to make that jump into a certain future, or are they going to wait and see that that certain future is, in their eyes, certain?
Good question. And do you think is there a risk with nation states accumulating too much Bitcoin? I mean, you're saying the amount of Bitcoin that the United States could stack. So what happens to the other holders of Bitcoin in that scenario?
Well, the better distribution of Bitcoin around the world, the better. And this is why we're working with more countries to educate them about Bitcoin. But I think it's not the end of the world if one country has a lot of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is proof of work. It's not based off of proof of stake, where the more you have, the more control you have. Let's just say like the US did implement this strategy, and they said, we're demonetizing gold. there's likely going to be a lot of mining still done in other countries. And the knock-on effect of that demonetization of gold could be that other countries just say, we're no longer selling ASICs to the US now. We're going to mine it all ourselves, or mine your transaction fees and get the Bitcoin out of the US that way. But yeah, it could lead to a war on hash rate, like trying to get the most hash rate to mine and control the network. But it's not that big of a risk because more hash rate can be added. It would just mean that now the US has to start ramping up their own silicon production and do it very quickly. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because technically they shouldn't be outsourcing such a critical piece of infrastructure components to other countries as well. So all in all, I would say it's not that big of a risk that one country has an outsized amount of Bitcoin or even hash rate, because this can even out over time. But it definitely is an advantage.
Yeah, definitely is an advantage. Do you think the dynamics of how do you think is going to change the demand dynamics once Donald Trump starts buying Bitcoin and accelerate rate? Do you think it's going to start like a FOMO in other countries? I feel that it's kind of starting right now with little like Vancouver government and other states in the United States starting to move some policies and legislations to promote Bitcoin adoption. But it hasn't been that big outside of North America. It has started in Japan, but how do you think it's going to this is going to play out? Yeah, how are the dominoes falling in the future?
Well, I think we're going to see a demand shock and a supply shock, unlike anything the world has ever seen before, because there's never been an asset of any type that has absolute scarcity, in this planet, right? So it has to reverberate through all these buyers that there is a finite amount. And I don't feel like most countries, most governments fully understand that it's finite. Like us Bitcoiners, we always talk about there's 21 million Bitcoin, that's it. But they don't really get it yet. And it's sort of an alien concept that there's something digital and finite. They might kind of hear it, but I don't think they fully understand it yet. And this is why Bitcoin is still hovering around, 0.1 M. I think we should have been well at 0.2 M or 0.3 by now. And I fully believe that once this kicks off, we're going to see $1 million per Bitcoin and higher, simply because of the demand shock feeding the supply shock, and both of these things playing off one another. But there's really not a lot of Bitcoin left. And I think there's even less than people suspect, because there's a lot of lost coins. So you're not fighting for, you're not trying to get 1 million of 21. You're probably trying to accumulate 1 million of maybe 15 or 14 million coins in reality. So this is all yet to really play out, and for these potential buyers to really digest and understand it. But I think 1 million is just like a conservative estimate. It's probably going to go much higher. It might shoot past 5 or 10 million.
Yeah, it's weird because even today, with the United States changing its stance towards Bitcoin, there are still countries, politicians, even CEOs. As we saw with Microsoft, the discussion last week, they are still reluctant to embrace Bitcoin. What do you think is going to be the turning point? What needs to happen for Bitcoin to gain general legitimacy in the world, and for people in positions of power to fully understand, to grasp the idea, and realizing, wow, we have been missing big time with this till this point.
Yeah, so I think Bitcoin already has that legitimacy, but people just don't understand it yet. So the biggest legitimizing factor was simply the largest financial institution on the planet, BlackRock, is launching an ETF. And if you look at the ETF metrics, this is the most successful ETF and fastest growing ETF they've ever launched. So I don't know how you can see that and ignore it, but that is what we see. And I think people just have to wait until Bitcoin's at 0.5 M or 1 million. And that's when they'll figure out, okay, well, this is something I better pay attention to. And as the saying goes, everyone buys Bitcoin at the price they deserve. And I guess they deserve it at that price.
Okay. Okay, that's nice. And what do you think is the best approach for a state to stack Bitcoin? We know El Salvador buys with a dollar cost average strategy. Bhutan mines its Bitcoin, and well, as we said, most of the countries has seized their Bitcoins. In a world where Bitcoin is every day scarcer and almost the whole supply is already issued, as you said, what do you think is the best accumulation strategy?
The best accumulation strategy for Bitcoin is to
For
buy a lot
state.
very fast, as fast as you can. Like, look at MicroStrategy. That is the goal. Do whatever you can to buy Bitcoin, borrow money to buy Bitcoin, especially if you're a nation state. Issue sovereign debt to buy Bitcoin. That's the basis of the Bitcoin bonds. So the right answer is fast. That's the best way. After that, mine it, DCA it, buy whatever you want, whenever you want. But the right answer is fast.
Yeah, but if you're, for example, issuing more money, issuing more debt in order to buy more Bitcoin, you're diluting the power, the purchase power of your people for buying Bitcoin. So in the perspective of a citizen, of an individual, will it be good for a state to earn more debt, to have more debt in order to buy more Bitcoin just to make it fast?
I mean, the question is really, what is the reason they're accumulating debt? Because countries have accumulated debt for really bad reasons, like buying vaccines or whatever, right? Like, if you look at a lot of the money printing in Canada and the US, it was to deal with the quote-unquote pandemic. Was that a good reason to increase debt for everyone? I don't think so. I mean, Canada bought more doses of vaccines than we have people in the country many times over. And that's all useless now. So there are far worse reasons that countries can accumulate debt, and they do that. Yeah, I mean, the citizens of the country should definitely accumulate themselves, but you would think, in theory, if governments exist for the purpose of serving the people, they should be accumulating Bitcoin so that they can do things with it, potentially, like build infrastructure, build roads, airports, and support growth. But yeah, I mean, individuals should definitely buy too, and fast.
And do you think the state should play a role as somehow a trader in which they sell Bitcoin in order to build roads and that kind of stuff, or they should just hold forever?
Well, it depends on, it's a balance. So if they're able to, like, let's not say buying Bitcoin. So not many countries, I think, will be able to buy Bitcoin, especially once things kick off. I think really it's the US that has, the US, maybe China can buy Bitcoin because they can print more fiat to support that. And there are reasons people want their fiat currencies. China for manufacturing, the US for paying off debt. But other countries, I think they'll need to mine it, or probably mine it or issue sovereign debt. But mining is probably the best way to go about it. But you can look at it as extracting oil, right? Countries will extract oil in the Middle East and sell the oil to develop. And if they develop, then technically they can change their industry to other things, high tech, more real estate driven, whatnot. So you can do the same thing with Bitcoin, or you can just hodl forever. But if you just have a lot of Bitcoin and your country's not developed or safe or easy to get to or travel around in, I think there's probably other problems. So it's really a balance.
Okay, that's interesting. And right now we are around more than 3 years after El Salvador making Bitcoin legal tender. But that making Bitcoin legal tender is not something that it's being discussed broadly right now. It's more like the Bitcoin treasury strategy and that kind of stuff. What are your thoughts on this? Is it a good idea for a state to give legal tender to Bitcoin, or is it just better to just buy? What do you think about this kind of legislation of making a Bitcoin money in a country?
Well, it depends on who you're trying to benefit. If the state is trying to benefit itself, then just build a reserve, and you'll have a lot of money. If you want the people to benefit, then you should say Bitcoin is legal tender or remove all capital gains taxes. And then they can be incentivized and educated to accumulate Bitcoin. So I think it really depends on what the goals are. I believe one of the goals for El Salvador was to boost tourism. So this Bitcoin law was to facilitate that. So people come to El Salvador, they're spending Bitcoin. The people there can keep it or they can swap it for dollars. And at least there is money coming into the country. So I think less developed, poorer countries definitely are looking at it from that perspective, that how can we stimulate tourism and money coming into the people? And I think legal tender is a good way to do that.
Okay, and have you heard of another country following that road, looking forward to make Bitcoin legal tender, at least in Latin America?
We're seeing some interest and we have some discussions going on, but there's another approach to it, which is the Argentinian way under Milei, which is deregulating money. So I think that's just as good. You can do both. You can say Bitcoin is legal tender, or you can just remove taxes. And in Switzerland, you can just pay anything you want with Bitcoin because there is no cap gains. Or you can take the Argentinian approach, which is you can use whatever you want as money. So all of these are valid. So there doesn't have to be a push necessarily for countries to say Bitcoin is legal tender. It's cool, and it's a good marketing boost, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And I think it's more of an endorsement, if not anything else, because legal tender is not enforced. Like if I go to buy pupusas and the store owner didn't take Bitcoin, I don't think anyone's going to jail. But technically legal tender, it means you must take it. So it is and it isn't legal tender. It's more of an endorsement and acceptance of Bitcoin as money. Now for JAN3, that's good for us because we can go to other countries and say, you can recognize Bitcoin as a foreign currency because it's the currency of El Salvador, which is a way for us to get it adopted in other places. So we had some discussions previously with the government in Guatemala and the central bank in Guatemala, trying to convince them to do that because there is a law there called the visas, which allows other foreign currencies to be used in Guatemala. And that's still an avenue we can pursue. But if Bitcoin is no longer legal tender in El Salvador, then that's just one tool in our toolkit that we have to discard for the time being.
Okay. Last question, Samson. Imagine we are having this same conversation the next year in December 2025. What has happened this year? How the landscape has changed in 2025? What are the highlights of this year?
Well, I think we're just going to see all-time highs all throughout 2025. How high we go, that's anyone's guess. I think 1 million is at least the bare minimum, and we'll probably end up beyond that. So if we talk again in a year's time, we'll probably be talking about how awesome it is and how little Bitcoin there is left.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Samson, for being here. Thank you for your time. That was a great conversation. I hope to talk with you again soon.
Yeah. Thank you for your time too, and it's been great chatting.
Ok, gracias a toda la audiencia de Criptonoticias. Recuerden que para seguir recibiendo contenido como este pueden seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales, suscríbanse al canal, pongan la campanita para recibir notificaciones aquí en YouTube y bueno, sigan Criptonoticias para mantenerse informado de todas las novedades de Bitcoin y el mundo de las criptomonedas. Muchas gracias.